I want to start with kind of tying in last unit to this unit. So last time we talked about the CRAP test and authority and how to evaluate sources. That's a little bit different when you're dealing with primary sources. Obviously, you were looking a lot at images or maybe some articles, but what parts of the CRAP test do you think you should still be thinking about?
I think is it in relevance, or it's talking about the time period that was published?
Currency, yeah, but relevance also. So both of those kind of go together. You definitely want to keep currency in mind. So when you're doing your searches, whether that's on one of those websites, in one of the books, if you're just in Harper's Bazaar, for example, you need to make sure you're within that time frame that we've talked about. You don't want to pull something from like 1950 and try and tie it into the novel. It's not going to work. Relevance is an important one, especially with those two extra sources where you kind of get to pick whatever category works best with your paper. You need to be thinking about what is your paper actually about, what are you trying to say, and how much of that source is actually relevant. What you don't want to do is, I found 3 random images, I'm going to shove them in this paper because I'm out of sources. So make sure you're getting things that are actually useful. And then think about the purpose, especially when you're looking at advertisements. So it's one thing to look at the visual and talk about maybe the way the person is dressed or the type of product they're selling, but even dig a little deeper than that and think about why is this product necessary, or why do they want women to think this product is necessary. So you'll see a lot of advertisements. One of the examples in the book is for like a cream that gets rid of your wrinkles or your freckles or whatever it is they're trying to sell. So when you're writing about that, there's kind of that base level. They want women to care about how they look. But there's more to it than that, and you can really dig into what's the purpose behind the product, behind the advertisement, behind the way that they're trying to market those products. So the CRAP test doesn't go away just because we've moved into a new unit. It will be even more important in Unit C when you're doing some real heavy secondary research into databases and academic journals. But this framework for this unit is scholarship as a conversation. It's a very short video. Can anybody sum it up? Do you guys remember what I'm talking about?
When you read somebody's research, it creates a discourse. So another person will use that research in their own research. Even sometimes that first person who did the research will respond, and sometimes it takes years and years and years for that to happen, but ultimately it creates a conversation within the community.
Absolutely, yes. So that was kind of the first point you hit exactly that I wanted to talk about, is the time frame of these conversations. Just doing research and publishing research, from starting your database searches to reading all of those articles to writing your paper to actually getting something through the peer review process and getting it published. And we'll talk about peer review next unit. That can take a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then other academics have to read your article and they have a response to it that requires them to do research and write a paper and get it through peer review. So it isn't like I'm going to sit down with Dan and have a conversation about this cool idea I have. It's 3 years from now, Dan's going to read about this cool idea I have, and then 3 years later, I'm going to read his response to it. So when you are getting into academic articles, it's important to remember that while you might be tempted to say, oh, something from 2015, that's 5 years ago, that can't possibly be relevant anymore, it's probably still considered new research. That's a new topic in academic timelines. So you have to keep an eye on how long these conversations can take. That conversation also takes place in a variety of formats. So being in college, you're all sort of aware of academic journals. That's probably most of the things you've been assigned to read in your classes. What other formats do academic conversations happen in?
That they happen in debates.
Debates, yeah.
Interviews?
Interviews. So sometimes, especially if someone has a book coming out, you might get a book review or an interview or that sort of thing. Another place that they happen is conference presentations. So you guys don't have a lot of opportunity as undergrads to go to conferences, but you do have some. You've got the EGO. Has that happened already, or is happening?
This Saturday.
This Saturday. So that is a conversation that students are having about their academic work. There are national conferences, like Sigma Tau Delta is the Honor Society for English majors. So they have an annual conference where students present their work, grad students present their work, professionals present their work. Each different type of academic field has conferences. Just within like librarianship, we have a health science conference, we have an academic librarian conference, we have a public library conference, and it's just places where for 2 or 3 days people are talking about their work, they're presenting posters, they're having dialogues. Some of those things will go on to be published papers, but the conference is kind of the place you can talk about it first and see what questions people have and what other things you need to address. There's also the wonderful world of academic Twitter, where a lot of these conversations are happening. So that might not be a place that you look for sources. That said, a lot of academics who are active on Twitter will have a part of a conversation and then link you to a paper, link you to an article, link you to some other thread that's going on. And then the other thing I want to talk about in terms of the conversation in academic journals and other types of publication is it's not always a friendly conversation. So we've seen a little bit of that last unit. If you guys remember, 1 week we had this scholar is great and then everything that they wrote is exactly the way that Emily Dickinson is. And then the next week you get like, this guy made a movie and it's awful and all of his research is terrible. So that's definitely out there. You get a lot of papers where it's responses to somebody else's idea and maybe it's an expanding on that. It's they did a great job, I'm going to borrow it and tell you more about it. But there's definitely some papers out there where people don't dance around the fact that they do not agree with other scholars. And depending on the field you're in, that can get pretty heated in a very polite academic sort of way, but if you learn to read it, you'll see that not always are those conversations uplifting and encouraging to one another. Something to think about also if you're going into academia and you're planning on doing research and publishing things is there is always the possibility that other academics are going to be like, no, you're wrong, and let me write a paper about how terribly wrong you are. So that's a thing you just have to be aware that could happen. That brings me to your role in the conversation. And I touched on this a little bit in the very short video, but you guys are having a conversation within the class. So your paper topics are contributing to the conversation we're having about this novel. And so I know as an undergrad, there's always that feeling of either I don't want to talk about what I'm writing about because I'm actually not confident with what I'm writing about and I think it's stupid and I don't want to tell you about it. But there's also that somebody else is going to steal my idea and I don't want to tell them the cool thing I'm writing about. And we can't have a conversation if we don't share our ideas. So that's part of what we're going to do in a minute is I want you guys to kind of pair off and talk about one source that you found so far, and it can be any of them. And instead of telling me how it has a conversation with the novel, which is what hopefully you're going to be writing about, I want to hear how your two sources talk to each other. So say if I've got an advertisement and Dan had this great etiquette article, I want to know what his article has to say in conversation with that advertisement. What are they getting at? Are they two different things? Are they in agreement? Are they arguing against each other? So we're going to do that. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions about what I mean when I just talk to each other or what that conversation is. You guys know what I'm asking you to do.
More so about how they like correlate or tie together.
Yep. So if you imagine like you had the person that drew this advertisement and the person who wrote this article and the person who like took this photograph, what are they trying to say with that, and how might they talk to each other with those things?
Any specific
Yeah,
ones you were looking at?
it would be really interesting, but it's
I was kind of doing a lot of like digital thing. I actually kind of type in researchers and just like looks up a boatload of stuff and that gets my ideas from that. Because if I do it the other way around, then I'm gonna write halfway and be like, and start all over. And so it's more about how Leon's hoping is why it's being taken. So what do you mean?
Like Dan said earlier, inside outside is kind of specific to this class. Inside being he assigned it, outside being anything in the whole world he didn't assign. Primary and secondary is really sort of historical research terms. So a primary source is anything that was present at the event, is the way that it's defined. For this class, that means anything that was created during that time frame of 1850, 1910. So advertisements, articles, newspapers, the novel itself is a primary source. You don't get to count that one because you have to write about it. But anything that was created and dispersed in that time frame. Secondary source is going to be anything after that that talks about the primary source. So you could find a secondary source written in like 1990 of somebody talking about the novel itself. That would be an outside secondary source. You could find an outside secondary source that's talking about the types of advertisements that you're using as your primary source. So that would be one way to do it. So maybe somebody wrote a paper about advertisements in the 1880s. That would be an outside secondary source that talks about that primary source that is the advertisements. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. In the resource guide that I gave you 2 weeks ago, the last page has a whole section on citing visual sources. These are the examples from that page. I just want to walk you through them. This one is an image from a book, so I've got the name of the artist and the page that appears on the book. So then your final works cited page. For the Hollins example, since it doesn't have an artist, you're not starting with a last name like you normally would. You're going to start with this description of what the image is. So the way that MLA citation works is you kind of have buckets of information, and you fill in as much as you have. So when you have everything, you should have your artist or your author as your first bucket, the title of the work. So in this case, this is a painting. So you've got the artist, the title of the painting, and then a description of what it is. That's the thing that gets added for visuals that you don't usually have to deal with for text. So in this case, this painting is a design for a stained glass window, and then you would add in your title of the book, your publisher, all of your usual citation information. In the case of Hollins, we don't have an artist, we don't have a title, it's just a cover image, so that's where you start. It's published in Hollins, this is the date, and you would add your URL. So when you guys are actually writing your paper, I know from my own work that citations are the thing that you do at the very end, like Tuesday morning before you print it out, usually. But if you're not sure how to do the citations, try and email me like by Monday night,